Today, we're diving into one of the darkest chapters in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. But we're going to look at it for what it truly was. This wasn't just a journey of unimaginable suffering. It was a journey defined by a brutal, cold economic calculation. Let's get into it.
So, let's start with this number, 12.5 million. Between 1525 and 1866, that's how many African people were taken from their homes, forced onto ships, and sent to the Americas. It's a number that's, well, it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around.
And then there's this number, 2 million. That's the number of people who never even made it. 2 million men, women, and children who died during that horrific journey across the Atlantic, the journey we now call the Middle Passage.
Now you have to understand, to move millions of people across an entire ocean, that takes a system. This wasn't just a series of random, chaotic events. No, this was a highly organized, terrifyingly efficient industry. And the very foundation of that industry, it all started with the ships themselves.
See, European merchants didn't just grab any old boat. By the 18th century, they were actually building ships specifically designed to transport human beings as cargo. Every single detail was a calculated measure. Those extra portholes, they weren't for comfort. They were there just to keep the cargo alive. The weapons, the netting stretched around the ship, that was all to crush any thought of rebellion and to stop the enslaved from choosing to jump overboard, from choosing death over slavery.
So, what was life actually like for the people forced onto these floating prisons? Well, the process of calculated dehumanization started the very moment they were brought on board. Just think about this. Upon boarding, a process that could take weeks or even months, people were stripped of everything: their clothes, any belongings they had, their very identities. Their heads were forcibly shaved. It was a systematic effort to erase who they were and reduce them to property.
And then they were moved below deck. They were crammed into these compartments with ceilings so low it was literally impossible to stand up. This is where they would spend most of this agonizing journey, packed in so tightly there often wasn't even room to turn over.
The conditions were, there's no other word for it, hellish. There was absolutely no sanitation. None. People were forced to relieve themselves right where they sat, right where they lay. You combine that with the suffocating heat, the lack of fresh air, the stench and the filth were just unimaginable.
And of course, in conditions like that, disease was everywhere. It just ran rampant. Things like dysentery, smallpox, measles. These diseases swept through the holds like wildfire, killing not just the enslaved people, but many of the crew members as well. Death was just a constant, daily reality.
Now, the experience below deck was deliberately segregated. It was all about maximizing control. Men were shackled together 2 by 2, which made any kind of organized resistance almost impossible. Women, on the other hand, were usually left unchained. But this wasn't some act of mercy. This supposed freedom just left them completely vulnerable to constant, horrific sexual violence from the crew. And the children? They were often allowed to move around, which meant they were forced to witness the full, unfiltered scope of this horror every single day. You might think that the 8 or so hours they spent on deck would be a relief. It wasn't. A huge reinforced wall called a barricade separated the men and women and, more importantly, protected the crew. People were forced to exercise, sometimes even forced to dance. A grotesque show for the crew's entertainment, all just to keep their muscles from weakening. Any sign of disobedience was met with brutal torture, often with a whip called the cat-o'-nine-tails. And for those who refused to eat out of despair, they were force-fed with this cruel medieval device called a speculum oris, which was used to pry their jaws open.
You know, for a long time, the full horror of the Middle Passage was kept pretty hidden from the public eye. But in 1783, that reality was laid completely bare. And it wasn't because of a survivor's testimony. It was because of a cold, calculated insurance dispute.
This whole story really comes down to one chilling question. For the owners of the slave ship Zong, the answer to this question was purely financial.
So here's the scene. The year is 1781. The ship, the Zong, leaves Ghana with 442 enslaved Africans on board. But the voyage is a total disaster from the start. The captain makes huge navigational errors. The ship gets lost at sea, and their freshwater supply starts running dangerously low. On top of all that, disease is spreading. And already 62 enslaved people and 7 crew members are dead.
So the captain does this absolutely brutal calculation in his head. He knows his insurance policy won't cover enslaved people who die from disease. To the company, that's just a business loss. However, the policy does cover cargo that is
jettisoned, thrown overboard to save the rest of the ship. His conclusion was monstrous. The living, sick captives were actually more valuable to his investors dead than alive.
Over the course of 3 days, the crew of the Zong took 130 living men, women, and children and threw them one by one into the Atlantic Ocean to drown.
And the outcome of the insurance trial that followed is, well, it's just chilling. The ship's owners actually sued the insurance company to collect the money for their lost cargo. Their argument was that since enslaved people were legally considered property, just like animals, they had the right to destroy that property to save their investment. And in a decision that just laid bare the complete inhumanity of the law, the court agreed. The owners won the case.
But that legal victory? It had a consequence they never saw coming. The public, for the very first time, was confronted with the undeniable legal truth of the slave trade, that human beings were being treated as disposable cargo. And that story became an incredibly powerful tool for the abolitionist.
So activists got their hands on those court records. They started republishing the story of the massacre everywhere. But here's the brilliant part. They often removed the name of the ship, the Zong. The message was crystal clear. This wasn't some isolated incident on one rogue ship. This was the logical, horrifying conclusion of a system that could, and absolutely would, happen on any slave ship.
The Zong case was a huge turning point in public opinion for sure, but it was far from the end of the story. The road to abolition was incredibly long and difficult. It took another 24 years just for the international slave trade to be outlawed, and then decades more and a whole civil war in the United States before the practice of slavery itself was finally abolished.
Remember where we started this explainer? With that huge number, 12.5 million? The story of the Zong is just this stark, brutal reminder that behind that staggering statistic are millions of individual lives, each with their own story. It forces us to ask ourselves, how do we remember history? And how do we make sure that a human tragedy is never, ever reduced to just a number?